Next, we talk with Professor John Jackson of Southern Illinois University about his new book, The Essential Paul Simon. The book reflects Paul Simon's interest in a wide range of public policy issues and is told through the writings of Paul Simon over a 40-year period. This runs about 25 minutes.
Professor John Jackson of the Paul Simon Institute, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Sure, I'm glad to be here, Terry.
You recently edited a book called The Essential Paul Simon, and I would think most of the viewers of the Illinois Channel would remember Senator Simon and his long career. But tell us a bit about the book, how it came to be, and why did you think it was important to put this book together?
Well, I think most, certainly older viewers recognize Paul Simon for the 40 years of public service that he gave, starting as a state representative and moving all the way to lieutenant governor, and then to the Congress, to the House first for 10 years, then to the U.S. Senate for 12 years. And then, of course, after he left the Senate, he came to SIU to establish the Public Policy Institute here. All of that's pretty well known and a part of the record. I think it's not as well recognized how much he wrote and how frequently he wrote about the great issues of the day and how much those issues really are still a part of our public discourse today.
You know, I was struck in reading through, I haven't had a chance to read through the entire book, but in reading through it, as you just said, how many of the issues that Paul Simon wrote about and championed are still the very issues that we talk about today. We have here in the introduction to the book, it says, Simon believed adamantly that we should pay for the public services we want and demand of our government. In Simon's worldview, it's just not fair to pass along those costs to our children and grandchildren. And of course, at the federal level today and at the state level, it's exactly the issues we're dealing with, the amount of debt that we have in government and how to pay for those.
Well, that's exactly right. People don't entirely recognize that either the state debt or the national debt are a result of prior decisions taken basically to enjoy public service without paying for that enjoyment of that public service. And we in Illinois have been guilty of that at the state level, and the federal government for decades has done the same thing. In some respects, it's more difficult now to address at the state level than it is at the federal level, but both governments are trying to face up to that, and the solutions are going to be extremely unpopular because all of a sudden we're going to have to either pay the bills or push them off again, and there's a question as to how long we can continue to push those bills off onto the next generation. And when you do that, obviously you're pushing the bills off to those who can't vote, those even unborn or certainly children of today, and having no say in the political process. It's been a very popular thing to do, and both parties are extremely guilty of having done that at both levels of government. And Paul was adamantly opposed to that. He thought that we ought to decide sort of the basket of goods and services, as the economists would look at it, that we wanted, and then we ought to raise the tax revenue necessary to pay for that collection of goods and services we wanted.
You know, I didn't know Senator Simon well, but I did have the honor of meeting him on a number of occasions. In fact, he was, along with former Governor Edgar, instrumental in establishing the Illinois Channel. But one of the things that we often hear said about members of the Democratic Party, tax and spend Democrats, and yet Paul Simon, I think it's fair to say, was a fiscal conservative, and one of the items that he championed while in Congress was to have a balanced budget amendment.
That's true, and it was unexpected of Paul Simon, the progressive, the liberal Democrat, to take such a strong position for the balanced budget amendment. He would often say, too, that while Democrats are tax and spend Democrats, Republicans turn out to be borrow and spend Republicans. So Again, Paul would say they were both equally guilty of having done pretty much the same thing. And he was opposed to that, and he garnered a lot of support on the other side of the aisle. Senator Alan Simpson came here for Paul's funeral, for example, a Republican from Wyoming that he served with. And Alan Simpson talked about the great respect that Paul had on the Republican side of the aisle because of his principled stances in the budgetary area.
And Senator Simpson still in the news because
still
he was
very much, yes, the Bowles-Simpson plan.
The Bowles-Simpson plan as far as deficit reduction. You know, another thing, we talked earlier about the issues that Paul Simon, who died in September of 2003, but some of the issues that he championed throughout his career and how they still resonate. And one of the issues that we continue to, unfortunately, deal with in Illinois is corruption within government. And there's a passage that he wrote, Paul Simon wrote back in September of 1964, the Illinois legislature, a study in corruption. And it's, I'm going to paraphrase here, he talks about one fellow who had served 11 terms in the House who estimated that 1/3 of the members of the legislature accepted payoffs. And Paul Simon wrote, in light of my own observations, I agree. Paul Simon was a longtime champion against corruption in government, was he not?
Well, you're quoting from the fairly famous article he wrote along with Alfred Balk regarding the Illinois legislature that he found when he joined it. It was published in Harper's Magazine. It became something of a statewide and even national sensation. And I think the corruption then was rampant, and I think he helped to blow the whistle on that. He also helped by establishing a very high standard of his own. He was the first major politician, for example, to reveal his income tax returns. No sanitized version. He just copied the returns. He copied all of the supporting material, and he gave a big stack of paper to the newspaper and journalistic people, and they were amazed in the early days that someone would do that. I think Paul believed near the end of his life that that kind of public corruption was not as rampant in Illinois in the General Assembly as it had been in the early days. I certainly think today the Illinois legislature is a much more honest body, and while we still have our problems with corruption and some high-profile recent cases, nevertheless, I think overall Illinois has made progress. But what Paul constantly worried about, and really till the end of his career and the end of his life, was the corrupting influence of big money, particularly campaign donations, and that's gotten worse, not better. Paul was an advocate for limits on campaign donations. He was an advocate for full disclosure. He was an advocate for public funding for federal elections, which of course we have had in the past for presidential elections. And all of that has basically not only fallen apart over the last 10 years or so, the role of huge amounts of money in our elections has only increased since his death.
You know, aside from going through the different issues that Paul Simon championed, and I said earlier that you edited the book, and edited it because it contains an awful lot of Senator Simon's writings when he was a newspaper man and up through the time that he was a senator and beyond when he was running the Paul Simon Institute, but would still publish articles on public policy and issues that he thought it was important to bring to light to the public. What in the larger sense is the purpose of the book, and what would you want the viewers to really take away from this?
I think Paul was convinced that his constituency, whether it was the Southern Illinois congressional district he served, or the whole state of Illinois, or the nation as a whole, was capable of understanding public policy. They needed someone to help break it down and put it in terms that average people relate to and eliminate some of the jargon, but he wanted a more informed citizen base. He wanted voters who were informed and who were rational and who basically reflected the facts of life rather than some of the myths and some of the nonsense that passes for campaign rhetoric today. He was convinced that he could talk to people where they live and that he could bring the intricate considerations of public policy home to Southern Illinois, to the state of Illinois, to those that he served, and that the public discourse could be elevated. And I think this book helps to do that. And I think his work is still very timely today in quest of that objective.
You know, Senator Simon, you have the advantage not only of having gone over his writings, but you knew him personally. What kind of an individual was he on a personal level?
Well, Paul was a great and unique person. He was really the straight arrow, straight-laced, almost choir boy figure that he cut. He was never any different in private. I've been with him in all kinds of circumstances at all kinds of times of the day and night, and after all the campaign events were over and you'd be driving back home, it would still be the same Paul Simon. He had a passion for politics, a passion for public service, and he also had two addictions. One of them was Pepsi Cola, which he drank in great quantities, and the other was writing. Paul was something of a workaholic, and when the Senate or the House were not in session, he'd come home to Southern Illinois, to Carbondale, and to his home in Makanda, and he'd constantly be writing, working on the next column or working on the next book. That was the Paul Simon that the public knew, and that was the real Paul Simon.
And of course, he started the Paul Simon Institute, and I think you were also instrumental at that time, serving, as I recall, as the chancellor at Southern Illinois University. What was Paul Simon's hopes for the Institute? Was it, again, a continuation of his really lifelong effort to educate citizens on public policy matters?
I think it was. I think there was a real effort to continue the outreach to citizen education, and that was a #1 objective. I think he also wanted to be around young people. He wanted to be around students. He loved and enjoyed interaction with young people. He was 75 when he died, but he was 75 years young in lots of ways because he literally taught our courses here at SIU up until nearly the time of his death. And so that was an added bonus for Paul. I want to point out, as you mentioned, Paul not only helped start the Illinois Channel, he also was very instrumental in that Master Public Affairs program at the U of I Springfield, then Sangamon State. He was one of the originators of that program, and that program and your Illinois Channel effort are really part and parcel of the same effort. All of that fits together as a kind of a seamless legacy that Paul Simon left us.
And I would say, you know, one of my regrets, I always had thought that someday I'll sit down with Senator Simon, we'll do an in-depth interview, and he, unfortunately, as you say, he seemed very vibrant. I believe he was a tennis player and was playing tennis within weeks of his death, which was untimely and unexpected. And it's one of my great regrets that we never had a chance to do that interview. In the end of the book, it says, there was, I think, taken from an article, 52 Simple Ways to Make a Difference, was a book that was published after Paul Simon's death. It says in here, his creed was personal service and a deep commitment to his fellow mortals, and he tried to make a difference in the lives of those he represented and those he met, whether in the hundreds of town hall meetings in his district and state, in his constituency offices, in a cab in Chicago, or at the St. Louis airport. You know, I'm wondering, having been a newspaper publisher and then a public servant for so many years and championing good government and the reforms that he did, here he wanted a balanced budget. We have massive deficits. You know, I just wonder if the different issues that remain unsolved. Did Senator Simon ever become cynical or upset the fact that those issues that he championed were still unresolved?
He really did not become cynical. He was one of the most idealistic persons you could ever meet, even though he certainly had a pragmatic streak. And he did survive in the rough and tumble of Illinois politics for 40 years. So he was no pushover. He did what he had to do to get elected, and of course got elected many times and lost very, very few elections in this state. But nevertheless, Paul was an idealistic person. I was speaking with him on a panel near the end of his life here before a group of students that we had at the Institute. And I was being at least skeptical and realistic about campaign finance. And he said, well, there are always reasons to be cynical, but we have to look at it that it's going to get better and that we have to keep advocating for it to get better. And so I thought that really summarized his constant outlook. He did get, I think, jaundiced and a little fed up with his colleagues in power who weren't willing to take the hard decisions that he thought that, for example, the Congress and the state legislature should make. But he never despaired over it. That book that you're talking about was his last book, published after his death. And it really reflects a sort of a Lutheran church commitment that Paul had to public service that I think he got from his parents, who of course were Lutheran church ministers, missionaries, and had a profound impact on his values.
You know, this is not a significant question, but his trademark was his bow tie. Did he ever discuss why did he wear a bow tie when everyone else was wearing the standard long tie?
It was an absolute campaign accident. He happened to wear a bow tie to an event one day when he was still over in Madison County and running, I think, the first time for state rep. And the newspaper article picked up the next day that the bow-tied Paul Simon spoke about this and that. And he thought, well, you know, maybe that's not a bad idea. I like bow ties, and so maybe I'll just keep doing that. So it became his trademark, and I think in some ways it was to epitomize his sort of unyielding commitment to who he was and his refusal to conform on some of the more modern day ways of dressing. And certainly campaign advisors told him he really needed to clean up his wardrobe, and he always refused to do that.
Yeah, he ran for president in 1988. Obviously he didn't win, but you know, it struck me that Paul Simon went very far in life, and yet he was never one of these glossy candidates. He had a great baritone voice, but you know, that aside, he wasn't the airbrushed politicians that we often see running for office these days.
Well, that's exactly right. And his joke was that he was in Dallas, and a TV interview there said, "You have a great face for radio." And he used to love to tell that because he had the great voice, but he didn't meet many of the stereotypes of today. And of course, we're in an era when there's a lot of renewed interest about Abraham Lincoln, and one of the speculations about Lincoln is because of his appearance and his sort of squeaky voice and his general demeanor. He would not have done very well on television in the modern era. And Paul Simon, of course, was an expert in Lincoln and also admired Lincoln greatly. But people have wondered whether Paul Simon was from an era of radio, not television.
Well, maybe it goes to show that if you stand up for your principles and can articulate them well, as Senator Simon did, and he had a great sense of history, that you know, people will respond. I think they think here's a real guy with even if you disagree with him on some of the issues, you can respect where he's coming from.
I think that's exactly right, and I think Paul counted on that. He was a kind of a what you see is what you get sort of guy, and he was particularly good, I think, in being able to articulate public policy issues and where he stood very clearly, and he would take unpopular positions and then he would go back home and talk about it. He almost got beat in 1980 in this congressional district, among other things, over the flag burning amendment. He was opposed to amending the Constitution to make it unconstitutional and illegal to burn the American flag, and he took a lot of flack over that, but he came back home and explained we've never amended the Bill of Rights, and he was not in favor of starting to do so, and ultimately he survived.
Last question before we close out. What would he think of his daughter, Sheila Simon, now serving as lieutenant governor, a position that he held himself under Governor Ogilvie?
Well, I think it would give him great joy because he had a lot of regard for his statewide service in the lieutenant governor position. It was an office he took and expanded and made much more important in its day when he did the ombudsman role. He had great ambition for Sheila, and I think he would be delighted to know that she has that same office today. As far as the book, The Essential Paul Simon, if someone is interested in purchasing a copy, is there a website or where would they find the book? Well, one of the handy things you can do is just download it to your Kindle or your Nook or whatever. It's on the Amazon site and you can download it electronically. There's a bookstore in Springfield, several bookstores in Carbondale, SIU Press, all have it for sale.
It's kind of funny with Paul Simon, always wrote on a typewriter. One wonders what he would think of downloading books to a Kindle.
I'm pretty sure he would not approve, but nevertheless, that's what the modern world has come to.
Well, Professor John Jackson, we appreciate you taking the time. The book again is The Essential Paul Simon, Timeless Lessons for Today's Politics. And we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about Senator Simon on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, sir.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.